Hi, my name's Kitty and I'll be giving a talk on international relations. This is primarily focused for those who've only been in a few IR debates, maybe those who've never been to IR debates, but I think will be equally be useful for people who are looking for a good refresher on international relations in general. So let's start. The first thing that is, I think, important before we get to anything else is just what is IR, as I will be referring to international relations as IR for the rest of the talk. And generally, and I think the most accessible definition comes from Wikipedia, which talks about it as the study of politics, economics, and law on a global level. This means basically that if you do have knowledge on politics, economics, and law, you shouldn't feel like you're at a disadvantage in an IR round because there's still information that you can use. Likewise, you can draw on this information in IR rounds to be able to help you build more robust cases. That also means that international relations is very interdisciplinary, meaning you can't just confine yourself into thinking that this information is exclusive to IR or that I won't have to touch economics because I'm bad at it. It's inevitable that all of these things affect an IR round, affect international relations, and even more so, they're affected on a global level. Secondly, international relations is concerned with the relationships between political entities. These are states, intergovernmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, and MNCs. So intergovernmental organizations like the United Nations, non-governmental organizations like Doctors Without Borders, and MNCs like Facebook. Think about how big of an impact Facebook already has and how much controversy surrounds it when it comes to things like elections in other states. So all of these actors and how they interact with one another is the main concern of international relations. And I think the simplest way to put it is international relations tries to understand how are things connected and how do these connections / relationships affect the behaviors, the outcomes, so on and so forth. So an easy way to think about connections is usually in four ways. They're either superior, meaning they have more power and to some extent influence you. Inferior, in that you have power as a state, perhaps, to control these individuals. Friend, meaning they're allies. Or foe, in that you can be antagonistic to these individuals. And all of these interacting relationships are what's studied, are what's theorized, and are what's observed in international relations. More specifically, however, is to discuss what is IR, quote unquote, in debate land. Because what's important to note here is that you're always going to have to choose a side in debate. It's not enough, like in international relations, to simply observe the outcomes and processes or theorize certain models. Because in a debate, it's about choosing one course of action or another, discussing an outcome. So because there are sides to take, the definition of Merriam-Webster I find generally more fitting for our purposes in this lecture, which is that it's concerned with relations between nations and primarily with foreign policies. And what's foreign policy? That's the strategy or approach to a state, an organization, or an issue. And that's where most debates will lie, in the foreign policy of whatever actor we're currently discussing, to a state, to an organization, or to an issue. I think this is the main focus of most IR rounds, and generally what we're going to focus for our purposes today, or whenever you're watching this. Since we're discussing foreign policy, the main thing I think that will help you both in understanding the events that occur, but also being able to utilize this information to help you in debates, is the foreign policy process. which always starts with an event, then moves on to a choice, a decision, a behavior, and then an outcome. And this is going to be a simple run through over the whole process, but we're going to break it down one by one later on. So to start, think of the riddle, or I don't know if you noticed at the start of my slide, I had the fox, the chicken, and the grain. And this is quite a common riddle. I'm not sure if any of you have never encountered this before, but just in case, this is it. That there's a farmer who needs to transport all three things to the other side of the river. The fox, the chicken, and the grain. Don't ask me why he needs to transport foxes. The problem is his boat can only fit one item at a time. So the question would be, in what order does he has to bring these items so that all of them are intact? Knowing that the fox will eat the chicken if left alone, the chicken will eat the grain if left alone, so on and so forth. So in this instance, the event is that the farmer has to bring all of these items towards the other side of the river. That's the goal. That's the situation he faces right now that is asking for a decision, and that's essentially what an event is. Second, you have a choice. So choice is basically what are the range of available options for the farmer. In this case, he has three very clear options. He can take the fox first, he can take the chicken first, or he can take the grain first. Next, we have your decision. Now, the decision is a little different from behavior because the decision is basically what you've made up to do, what you've made up your mind to do, but haven't actually acted upon yet. But most of the time, the behavior will be a follow-through from the decision. So it's not like the farmer will decide, I'll bring the chicken first, and then start grabbing the fox instead. So the decision is basically, okay, I've decided to bring the chicken first. And the behavior is he grabs the chicken and takes it first. So maybe for our purposes today, he decided to grab the grain first, maybe the sack of grain, because he felt it was the easiest to carry, whatever. So he takes it, puts it on his boat, and goes to the other side of the river. The outcome then is that when he returns to his side to pick up the next item, he sees a fox and a dead chicken, and now his family will no longer be able to eat chicken for the week. And that's essentially the same events that happen in foreign policy. But note that it's a cyclical process. So as a result of his decision in which he now has a dead chicken, the next event happens and the next choice happens, meaning he now has to deal with how is he going to feed his family for the future? Are they going to live on grain alone? So on and so forth. So outcomes produce new events which lead to choices, and that's what makes it one big process. But the reason why I think this encapsulates IR very well is because the best decisions are made when you understand the relations of different actors to each other. So you know which item to pick first based on the relationship the fox has with the chicken has with the grain, and that's essentially what foreign policy is about. Okay, so step one, or first phase of the process, is understanding the event that even caused this decision to be made in the first place. Now, most of the time, your motion is going to be inspired by or influenced by a certain current event that's happening now. And when you're reading the news, you want to look out for three things when you try to understand an event. The first is always who is involved in this event. And you're looking at probably 5 or 6 different types of actors. The first, like I've mentioned, are interstate or intergovernmental organizations. So United Nations, World Trade, EU, ASEAN, so on and so forth. These are usually the bigger players in international relations, They're the environments in which a lot of these decisions are made. So usually you'll find one or several involved. The second are non-state. And while I did mention Doctors Without Borders, also think of non-state actors as groups like terrorist groups, for example. ISIS, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, so on and so forth, are also considered non-state actors who have global implications because of their actions and are therefore also equally important, and a lot of the times the cause of a lot of these events in the first place. Third is the state. And usually, unless this specific event happens right in the middle of open waters, there's always a state involved because they're the ones whose borders or within its borders these events have happened. In certain instances, it can be multiple states who claim this area, and that's why all of them are involved. Fourth, you have individuals. In most instances, individuals are not involved because they're usually represented by their states or by other organizations that exist. So you wouldn't most of the time see specific individuals unless in certain instances like Kim Jong-un is essentially North Korea. So the state and the individual might sort of meld together. But when I talk about individuals here, I'm saying that in certain instances, there are individuals who have global impacts and global influence that cause certain decisions or certain discussions within the IR field. So an example being Greta Thunberg, for example, and the discussions that are now being created on the environment and a country's responsibility towards protecting the environment, so on and so forth. So it's rare, but it does happen that individuals on their own do have global impacts that cause events or that are worth talking about. And like I mentioned before, you can also have MNCs, Google, Apple, always big topics in IR. But lastly, you have the people. And when I mean the people, I'm talking about usually the minorities, the victims, general society, people on the ground, who most of the time are the most affected, the least represented, and the least powerful. IR discussions tend to be very ivory tower, let's say. A lot of it happens in the ivory tower because we're talking about big picture events, very highbrow, that sometimes it can get away that we're really talking about human lives here. And I think that's what's important when you're analyzing events. So when you're talking about a refugee crisis, obviously you want to also talk about the very well-being of refugees versus the discussion or analyzing what's the impact on the countries who are taking them. So who is involved? Note that there's always the smallest person involved. They might not be mentioned in the article sometimes, but they're there, and it's always good to look at who are the victims of this event. Who is being most affected? When we're talking about sanctions, when we're talking about going to war, who are these people and how are they involved? They're also an equally important actor to look for when you're talking about events. Second thing is the facts. Now, the facts are not really negotiable or disputable things because they're recorded, they happened, and they're very different from your interpretation of facts. So, for example, in this instance, let our event be China building structures in the sea south of China and west of the Philippines. So that's a fact that China has built structures there. Now, the interpretation of facts can be, in China's perspective, China is simply building structures in its territory. And the rest of the world can feel like China is building structures in disputed areas, in actively disputed areas. So it's a fact that they built something, but how that's being interpreted by different individuals is the interpretation, quote unquote, of the facts. And who is involved? China. You have ASEAN, basically everyone who's got a claim over the islands in question. You can also talk about interstate organizations like the UNCLOS, who is supposed to guard the maritime and enforce maritime laws and whatnot. So all of these things are important in analyzing an event. But why are they important? Easy. First is because at the very least, you're not clueless. So, I'm not gonna lie here. IR is matter heavy. You will need matter at some point, and you are going to be at a disadvantage without matter. It's not a guarantee that if you don't know anything, you're going to lose, because there are certain principles and like basic events that can help you navigate through the round, but you're going to have to accept that you are at a disadvantage, versus if you at least know the event that inspired these motions, you're not clueless and you have more options available to you. Second is in terms of setting priorities within the debate. So in this case, at the very least, it'll help you determine in this debate, who do we want to prioritize? Who do we think is the most important individual in the room? And it's already a preemption over what your opponents might say, when you can already say, okay guys, of all the actors involved in this event, this is who we want to protect. This is the individual who, even if they face more harms than others, we're okay with, so on and so forth. Being able to make those strategic decisions depend on you knowing who's involved in the first place. So setting priorities, saying whoever wins this debate is the one who can best show how we uphold the interests of X, already puts you ahead of other individuals. But lastly, as we all know, in debates, it's ultra important to figure out who is the house. If it's not clear in the motion, then it's usually up to you to determine who are we and who do we value. And you can't answer any of those questions unless you at least have some idea of what's even happening around you. I mean, there are certain safe answers, like we are the UN, we are general society, or we are the states. But the more nuanced and more specific your answer is, the easier it is to defend and to be believable, because you can make better decisions. So the gist is, better decisions within debate rounds come from having information. Having the right information comes from being able to break down events. So next time you're looking at some news article that happened, always try to write down the actors, the facts, and what different parties are saying, or how they're even interpreting the facts. And the best way to do that is to vary where you read the news. Even if you might not agree to what other news sites say, at least you have a better understanding of how they interpret things. You know, think like the enemy by reading what they read, so on and so forth. So, second part of the process is the choice. And this is the range of options available for the actor. Now, we talk about a range of options precisely because your choices are inherently limited by the resources that you have. So if in the initial example, you have a boat that can only fit one item or animal, in the same way, the choices of states and actors and government organizations, and so everyone, is limited by the resources that are available to them. On, I think the simplest way is to talk about it in 3 levels. The first is it's limited on their power, meaning what they can do on their own. Second, it's limited by their allies, meaning what they can do as long as they have help from other individuals. But last is what they're willing to do. And all of these things have to be considered when you're trying to debate between what choices are we really picking from. Because a nation might have the power to do it, but might not be willing to do it. Or sometimes the nation might think they have the power to do it, but really they don't, but at least they have the allies. So back to the China building structures in the West Philippine Sea example. The Philippines has a range of options. We can do nothing, and doing nothing tends to usually always be an option. We can go to war, we can file a case, we can ask our ally, the US, or former ally US, we'll see, for help. And all of these things are within our power or within the power of our allies. But then when we talk about what we're actually willing to do, that's a different thing. So some people might believe we have the power to go to war with China, but not have the risk appetite because we're not self-destructive. So all of these things are important to consider when deciding what are the range of choices and options available for this actor, given the event we find ourselves in. But the second important thing to note is, I guess this is just a brief overview on what are the kinds of power, therefore what are the kinds of choices countries can even make in the first place. And there are many types, but the basic two is hard power and soft power. So what's hard power, what's soft power? Hard power is straightforwardly military power. It's about coercion. It's not about it's about, yeah, actually it is coercion via sometimes or most of the time violent means, war, fighting you to get you to do what you want. My overwhelming hard power is what's going to cause certain countries to change how they behave. Soft power, on the other hand, is more subtle coercion. It's not about violence, but instead of forcing you by fear, it's more about enticing you towards certain options. So this tends to be through the use of cultural and goodwill sort of instruments. And I think the best example of this is to think about how you view Japan versus how, let's say, a post-World War II Filipino would view Japan. I'm sure to their minds, a lot about Japan is that they oppressed the Philippines, there was an occupation, there was comfort women, and there was a lot of bombings, and then they burned Manila down to the ground. So, not a very good image of Japan. But maybe for a lot of us right now in our current generation, Japan is really nice, really clean, and has really great anime and manga. And the reason why your perception changed isn't just by coincidence they have fun shows, but a lot of this was a deliberate foreign policy strategy to change Japan's perception to Asian countries so that they have a bigger range of choices and more coercive power towards individuals. That's why you have things like Japan Foundation, and this was a deliberate strategy of like heart-to-heart diplomacy that did happen and was created by Japan in order to improve its image in Southeast Asia specifically, as in it literally was called heart-to-heart diplomacy. And the same thing goes with other countries. So you have Korea with K-pop, BTS, you have the US with Hollywood, and all of these improve the image because when your citizens feel like a country is perceived as good, as fun, as something you aspire your country to be like, you're more willing to work with them. And this is all about exerting that power. But as you see in the image right now, power is a gradient. It's not a checklist. It's not option A or option B, because you can exert a little hard power and a little soft power. You can stop right before going to war and still exert some hard power. And I think one example is the United Nations behavior towards North Korea. So a lot of resolutions on banning exports, crude oil, materials came from North Korea, came from UN resolutions. So they're basically flexing certain hard powers into stopping North Korea from exporting items. So that's using more, not super violent, but definitely just not coercive means. But at the same time, when North Korea had in famine, they helped raise $120 million in donations to help North Korea and give relief aid, which a lot of the times is a little more coercive. It helps build goodwill that North Korea, or at least indebtedness that North Korea might feel towards the UN. So was the UN using soft power? Was it using hard power, or was it sort of using a carrot and stick model? That's something that shows that when you're deciding how an actor should act, essentially, think of it more in terms of choices occur on gradients versus or spectrums versus choices just occurring with blunt A or option B only. So how then should choices be applied in debates? And there's 3 ways to do that. The first is to figure out and limit the debate to feasible options. When you're government, it's much easier to be able to say we're comparing these 2 options versus saying it's this versus everything else that opposition will throw at us. And the more you understand how nations and how all other actors decide what options are even available in the first place, it's easier to defend or rebut which options people are claiming in the debate are just not feasible, or just something that an actor would not even consider in the first place because of the risk appetite, because they don't have the allies to achieve it. So just by eliminating other options, you can narrow the debate to where you're more advantaged, or you can just eliminate whole teams by saying, sorry, your choice just isn't something that even should be considered in this debate because XYZ. Secondly, is it helps you be more comparative. The end goal, I think, when deciding whether we should take certain options, whether we should sanction or bomb or whatever, is you want to be highly comparative. And the way you want to come off is not to say, this is a good option, let's do it, but to say that our option is the best of all those that are available to them right now. So you not only narrow down the debate, but you also make it seem as if, well, you're clearly the best and only logical option to take. Because if you just say, well, it's a good option without weighing all the others, it's easier and you leave openings for yourself, for opposing teams essentially to come say, but wait, there are other options you have to consider, versus you being the one to set the limits and say, given these are resources, these are the only ones available right now, and this is the best available option we have, so let's take it. It just sounds better, it's more strategic, and opposition teams will have to have a second burden of proving why that's not the only available option before even forwarding their own choice or their own strategy. So giving others a hard time is always a good thing to do. But last is you sound grounded and realistic. In that, by saying, well, this is the option we have considering all our resources, you sound like you know what you're talking about, versus saying, hey, this would be a nice thing to do, because it doesn't sound well thought out. And that's not something that will give you any extra points in a speech if your option doesn't sound well thought out. So you want to sound realistic, because the more realistic it sounds, the more you'll benefit later off in terms of proving its effectivity, its feasibility, and the likelihood of it succeeding. So all of these things stem from you first being able to establish that this is the best of all available options. Third, the decision. So this is the selected but not yet acted upon choice. And usually this is where the debate usually lies. Again, this is about what should we pick, which choice would we take. And there's a lot of ways to break this down, and I'm going to show you 4. Because generally, as Harold and Margaret Sprout have said, international politics is meaningfully related to the setting, environment, or milieu in which decisions are taken. In short, how should I, in my argument, prove that they should take this decision, or that another nation will definitely choose this, that's why we have to already sanction them now. So it'll help in proving why you should do this, or predicting how other nations will act, that's why you can have a preemptive response. And like the quote said, because politics is related to the setting, environment, or milieu of decisions. In short, in decision making, you have to take into consideration 4 things. These aren't, again, the only 4 things you can consider, but I think they are important. They're somewhat easy to consider, and I think they're a good starting point. So you have to consider the societal, which is where am I? Psychological, who's in the driver's seat? Where should I go? Self-perception. And how does the road look? AKA the operational code. Do not fear, this will all be explained. And first up we have societal. So decisions are usually influenced by the culture, history, and geography which led the actor to its current state. That's why they are societal influences in terms of why is this actor in the current state that it's in, can usually be informed by what happened in the past. So if you think about that's Japan, by the way, and nuclear power, whether that be nuclear weapons as a result of the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or the Fukushima meltdown. Basically, Japan has a complicated relationship with nuclear weapons and war in general, and therefore its culture tries to promote pacifism because of its history. That's why, as a result, current decisions by Japan are usually made to avoid conflict or to have its allies handle conflict for it. For example, the mutual agreement of security and cooperation between the US and Japan. That's why the US has bases in Okinawa precisely because of Japan's culture, history, and geography. And so you can use all of these past instances to justify why Japan isn't suddenly going to change its constitution to allow the development of nuclear weapons, or isn't just going to start randomly starting a war because it's tried for so long after World War II to promote a pacifist culture within its society and its people, and it tries to make everyone as war averse as possible. So that can be used in your argument as a justification as to why, even if Japan could, they definitely will not take this choice, or that's why they shouldn't even take this choice in the first place. So that's always option 1. Where is the country? Why is it in its current state? And use that to inform future decisions that it should, it could, or decisions that it definitely won't make. So we should remove it from consideration at all. Second, who's driving? So these are the motives and personalities of decision makers as well as the power structures which control the decisions. And to a certain extent, we always talk about the head, meaning the president, but a robust discussion on who's driving should also focus on the structures which at the very least limit the decisions. So for example, if we're talking about Trump, yes, he's quite the powerful personality that he is, but you have things like the Supreme Court, you have Congress, which may change in terms of who has majority, same with the Senate, and that's a general thing that's true for almost all democracies, unless of course you have a government of yes men, that certain structures which control decisions means the motives and personalities of the head isn't always what comes out on top. But it will still always be one of the biggest indicators as to how countries will act, because it is a litmus test of how people feel. That means usually they won because what they're thinking is what everyone else is thinking. That's why they won an election, for example. So knowing their motives and personalities can sort of give you an insight into the motives and personalities of the majority of people within the nation for that current period of time. So using the personalities and motives of these people will, of course, help you justify, of course, Trump's gonna do this. That's why we have to choose this option to defend ourselves. Or, yes, Trump will want to do this. It's the best option he has right now for his future re-election. So all of these considerations for how to analyze and argue for a certain course of action does happen because you take into consideration motives and personalities. But that also assumes you do know who the decision maker for each actor that you're talking about is. So if we're talking about the United Nations, for example, you have to understand the motives and personalities of the Security Council, for example, or individuals who have veto power within the UN, or even just larger voting blocks that exist, what are their motives, and so on and so forth. So just an understanding of who makes the decisions and who or what systems can control the decision makers is the second way in which you're able to justify decisions and will also build up your analysis. Third, where should I go? So this is as easy as saying it's an actor's view of the role and goals. Now, the role here is, what does the country's self-perception of itself in the international arena tell you about it? So maybe before Trump, the US felt as if it was the world police, or that it had a obligation to stop terrorism globally. That is an actor's view of their role. It might not be what everyone else thinks the role is, but what's important is they think themselves that. Or how Germany now might feel that it's the next bastion of human rights and basically has to prove that the European Union experiment worked, or whatever it feels like it is that this will tell you how a country is more likely going to act because it has a role in its head that it wants to fulfill. But usually role fulfillment is also the same as having a goal. So whether the US, when it was a world police's goal, was, I want global security as my ultimate goal, then it's easier for you then to decide, well, this nation, because this is its goal, it should take this choice, or it should enter into diplomatic talks with this terrorist group because that's its main goal, and it's willing to forego other risks, or it's willing to take on all these other risks in pursuit of that goal. Another, again, multiple types of goals. But the very first thing, and what almost every thing has in common, is the need for self-preservation. I'm not really sure if there's any actor or state whose ultimate goal after creation is to die or to cease from existence or whatever else. So whether, again, like in our earlier scenario, all individuals seek further self-preservation and to make it across that river. Second, usually there are some individuals who want to gain something from these interactions. So while there are actors who will be perfectly safe and okay with maintaining the peace, there will be those who want a treaty, maybe a trade agreement from these interactions. I want you to give me aid, resources. So there will always be these individuals who want self-gain. But lastly, there are individuals who want domination. So it's not enough that I'm a country that exists. It's not enough that I have a good economy because I've gained from all of these interactions, but I want to be seen as a superpower. And that's my next goal. So take China, for example, who usually after they feel like self-preservation and self-gain has been achieved, will try then to go for domination. So it's sort of like you can assume that everyone's goal is self-preservation, but the more that goal is secure, there will be nations that now want self-gain. More than just gaining something, there will be people who want to gain everything. So keep in mind that where should I go is, where does this country or this actor actor or this organization see itself in the future, and what's its role to even get there. And that's, again, another level of analysis that you can use for these individuals or for justifying certain courses of action for another. Last is, how does the road look? So what is the pathway to get to where I want? And this is an actor's view on international politics and world structures. So if we know how an actor views themselves, the second thing to look at is how do they view others. And this is generally where the more theoretical side of international politics comes in. And I feel like I keep saying this, that there are many different types of theories on how international politics works. These are the very two basics, realism and liberalism. A lot of other branches on theories on how IR works are branched off from these two. So you both have neo-realism, neoliberalism, offensive realism, you have structuralism, and the list goes on. But all of the other theories are still hinged upon your understanding of the basic two things. So an actor can view the international arena as realism or liberalism. Now, this tackles the age-old question of, are people inherently good or are they inherently self-interested? Realism states that, well, states are run purely on self-interest. They think they're the most important. They believe that security and survival are the primary goals, and the only way to achieve these goals is to just help themselves. These are the nations who a lot of the times feel like it's a dog-eat-dog world, and I can only trust myself. So you will always have countries who think that way, who think that usually they're going to be highly invested in self-defense, in having their own military, a lot of the times in trying to develop nuclear programs because it's in their interest and they can only protect themselves. But on the flip side, you have liberalism, which states that humans are inherently good and cooperation is king. So you have countries who are very, very willing to form allyships, to participate in international arenas, because they feel like the only way we can get ahead is together. And how a country views how others will react is important, again, in determining how it's going to create decisions in the first place, how willing is it to talk versus to go to war, so on and so forth. So it's important to note that all of these things don't necessarily exist in harmony with each other. That means psychologically, for example, in terms of the who's in the driver's seat level, this person might be a strongman, self-interested, does not believe in cooperation, but the state as a whole and all of its structures is one that is actively participative in international arenas because it's very liberalist. It has a history of cooperation with individuals because of its society and its culture. And so it's not always the same, and how they interact, whether they exist in harmony with each other or contradict with each other, and that interplay will also affect the end decision in the end. So these are important ways in how to elevate your analysis, but also how to, I guess, rebut other individuals' analysis by saying, okay, if we're only considering how the president thinks, fine, they're probably going to choose this, but there's a myriad of other factors to consider, such as X, Y, Z, and when we consider all of them holistically, this is the correct decision to make. So just keeping all of them in mind, again, makes for better argumentation and analysis in international relations. But let's go back to our favorite example of China building structures as the event, with choices being do nothing, go to war, file a case, ask our allies. So let's say in this instance, the Philippines has decided, therefore, we're gonna fight. Not like violently, but the point is, our decision is we're going to take a stance which actively opposes China and its structure building. That is the essential decision that we've made, considering maybe a history of oppression of our president at the time, of how we view the world and how we're actually very active in terms of the international arena, and so on and so forth. And how we view our role actually as like the leader of ASEAN. And considering all that, for example, the decision of the Philippines is we are going to actively oppose China's behavior. The next thing you have to consider is observable artifacts of the decision. So we did it, but how? So we've already eliminated other choices available to us in terms of doing nothing or asking an ally, because we decided it's going to be about an opposition to China based on step 3, our decision. Behavior now is what is the observable artifact of the decision. Means, how can you prove that we even decided to oppose them in the first place? Because as much as we'd like to just say we're going to oppose it, behavior is all about actions. So did we send ships to block Chinese vessels? Did we impose sanctions? No. In our instance, we filed a case in the UNCLOS. So that essential filing of a case and that case present maybe in the docket or whatever is a observable artifact of the decision that we've made, and a lot of it is very important in signaling to other nations that this is what we're willing to do, this is what we've done, because note that events are affected by the behaviors of individuals. So you can say it, but if you don't do it, there's no behavior. If there's behavior, then essentially this is what other people will react to. So in the same way, this is important, and this is sometimes where the debate actually takes place. So sometimes it can be on what decision should we make. Other times debates about how to best execute that decision that we've made. And so you want to pick something that's somewhat realistic, that's feasible, and that has a high likelihood of success. The other reason why knowing the behavior or the way we should act out the decision is important is because it's good at delineating yourself in the debate, because you're not speaking in just general terms of, okay, let's oppose China. It's about saying these are the specific policies we want to make. So it's great for both first speakers and even if you're in BP, the latter half of the debate, in being able to delineate specific policies and specific benefits that only come out because you explained that policy or because you explained how this behavior has a physical effect on its environment or on the different actors. So specificity brings with it more benefits generally. And the last thing to talk about then is the outcome. So this is the end result of executing your foreign policy. And when you're talking about outcomes, you want to talk about two things: short-term and long-term outcomes, and who is this outcome affecting. So you want to talk about short-term outcomes to yourself, to your allies, and to, in certain instances, whoever you are against. And the same thing with long-term outcomes. Are the benefits you got on the short term something that is sustained or something that doesn't matter in the long run? So again, back to our usual example, we won that case against China in the UNCLOS, and so for the short term, it was seen as quite a victory for the Philippines. As a matter of fact, to our allies, they started sending ships, started sending ships on the West Philippine Sea in freedom of navigation exercises, because we empowered more actors because of that decision that we were right, into, just like ignoring what China's doing. And to our antagonizer, well, it made China kind of look bad. But obviously there was more effects. But this is just the simple top line short-term effects. Long-term outcomes is an entirely different story. It's a question of were we able to sustain that victory, especially to ourselves when we're now under joint exploration agreement, when we admitted, or when our president admitted that there's nothing we can do anyway. So while an outcome is certainly present in short term, a question of whether we can sustain those outcomes for the long term is a entirely different debate in and of itself, and can be used a lot of the times in IR debates, because there's no set in stone principle that long-term outcomes are always more important than short-term outcomes or vice versa. That in itself is an issue in the debate, but more than looking at short-term versus long-term outcomes, I feel like a lot of people don't consider what outcomes to who is more important. So you can compare not just short-term versus long-term, but the short-term outcomes to ourselves is kind of bad, but the short-term outcome that we benefit from being able to take down our antagonizer and the effects on them is totally worth it, even if it brings us down a little. So comparing short-term to short-term outcomes to different people is also a different way to measure outcomes in debates. So that's essentially the whole foreign policy cycle. Each one can be used and is important, but the last thing I want to leave is why is the cycle important in and of itself. And there's a general problem that a lot of people bring up in IR rounds, is that you can never guarantee the compliance of other actors with agreements, principles, norms, and etc. You're never sure if anyone's going to follow. And the same is true, but usually this is why we consider what we call the Nash equilibrium, which is one cannot predict the choices of multiple decision makers if you just analyze decisions in isolation. So you have to ask, what would other people and what do you expect other people to do, and then make decisions based on that. So like we've done with the same riddle, the best decisions are made if we don't analyze our own decision in isolation, but we base it on what are the decisions everyone else is going to make, and then make our decision from that. If that was confusing, it's the same as saying we know who to take on the boat first, because we know if we leave the fox, his decision is to eat the chicken. If we leave the chicken with the grain, we know the chicken's decision is to eat the grain. And because we've considered other people's decisions, we make the best decisions for ourselves. And that's the same with nations. Never think that states will just make a decision based on what's best for itself, but because it always interacts with other individuals, it's always making the best decision given how other people will decide as well. And that's what essentially stops the enforcement problem from being a problem in the first place. The fact that you can never guarantee compliance is mitigated because of two things. First is iteration. It means that gains are a continuous stream of payoffs. So fine, in the first time I made this decision to impose sanctions, I came out on top. But we're going to keep interacting again and again. And maybe if we had just come to a trade agreement at the start, we would have had greater benefits over time. And that's generally what iteration means. That what you gain isn't just one shot and then we're never going to talk to each other again. It's a continuous streams of payoffs or costs. And utility is always greater over time with cooperation, because you're going to meet them again in the UN, or you're going to have to deal with these individuals again. And that's the same thing that reciprocity says. That nations tend to work tit for tat, meaning they're going to copy your move from the last round, and that makes a punishment and reward mechanism. You did this to me, so next time I'm in the power to do it to you, I will do it to you. That means that you can actually guarantee to a certain extent compliance with agreements, principles, and norms, because it's a cycle and you don't know if you're going to come out on top anyway. But if everyone does agree and comply, then we can more or less keep things rolling. And so understand that that's analysis as to why principles do exist and why principles are important in international relations. Things like trust, things like keeping your word are all valuable principles to follow in international relations, even if maybe not as tangible as clear payoffs, like at least we get this resource, or at least we get this piece of disputed land. And the reason why these principles, or we can even argue in principles, is because of things like iteration and reciprocity, which essentially remove the enforcement problem. And these things, again, only happen because of, like what we said in the previous slide, the Nash equilibrium, that people don't just make decisions in isolation, but it's always about thinking how others will think and how others will react before I make my decision. Very last slide then. So you're going to now go to an IR round, for example. What are the things you have to keep in mind? The first is that IR is based on imagination, because people are fluid in the ways they organize themselves. So if you think about chickens, they have a very strict pecking order. That's why it's called a pecking order. And these structures don't change. One day chickens won't decide we're going to be a democratic society and we're going to vote on who should get to eat first. They're essentially the same all throughout time, unlike humans are fluid in the ways they organize. So if you enter a debate and you're like, but it's never been done before, that doesn't mean it never will, because humans are fluid. In the past, we didn't have democracy, socialism, communism, and you never know if there will be like democratic lotteries in the future. So just because you don't have the information doesn't mean you can't use your imagination in IR rounds. Second is history repeats itself. So when you're matter loading, you want to look for several iterations of commonly implemented strategies. And you want to look for both common cases and outliers. So when have sanctions worked? When have they not? When have diplomatic talks worked? When have they not? And it's always a good idea, I guess, to keep a list of these examples so that they're easy to kind of throw out during the debate and prove commonalities. Look, sanctions didn't work here. This situation is similar to that situation, hence sanctions won't work. But those types of easy, confident arguments are things you can't make unless you come prepared beforehand with a knowledge of these patterns. Third, familiarize yourself with foreign policy of main actors, meaning who is the, and usually if you have to pick actors, you want to go for both the geographic leader and the geographic outlier. So who is a strong influence in the Middle East? Maybe like Saudi Arabia, for example. Familiarize yourself with their foreign policy, and maybe an outlier. Who goes against Saudi Arabia? If it's maybe, or you can talk about Iraq, for example. So these actors will come out again and again and again in multiple debates, so you might as well familiarize yourself with them now. But last is, don't confine yourself to IR motions. Even in motions you don't think are IR rounds, they can always have international implications to domestic policies. Meaning, yes, you can insert that IR angle as an extension if you try hard enough. So don't limit yourself to, I can only use these things during IR rounds, and be creative with it. This is just my list for further reading. I won't really explain it, just that a lot of what I have is only from professors, from older debaters, coaches, teachers, and in the same way that all of this information is just being passed from them to me, information can also be passed to you through these, or this is what I use, but again, there's way more resources out there. And that's it. Thank you for, if you've managed to make it this far, then thanks.